Okay.
There you go. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Valerie. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, especially for organizing these Tennyson talks and for inviting me to participate in this first round of them. And thank you very much to everybody who's here. It's great to see so many people. I know that it's never convenient, especially as Valerie was saying, for an international audience. And so there's never a single convenient time, and I'm grateful that you all made the time to be here. So this is new material. I've never presented it before. It's from an article that I began writing over the summer and that I specifically intended and intend for the Tennyson Research Bulletin. So I'm particularly happy to be presenting it to this group tonight or today. And so I'll begin, and I'll begin with my title, Tennyson and Sappho Revisited. And the word revisited is there because as I started to work on this material, I soon realized that I would be standing on the shoulders of giants in this field. And specifically, I want to acknowledge Margaret Reynolds' simply wonderful essay. Here it is. It was published as a Tennyson Society monograph in 2001 called Fragments of an Elegy, Tennyson Reading Sappho. And I have to say, one of the great pleasures of working on this topic was getting to revisit this long essay or short monograph, which I had not read since it was first published, or had not reread since it was first published over 20 years ago. And I'd forgotten just how good it is and how wide-ranging. And I really feel that anything that I have to say today is just a series of footnotes to Margaret Reynolds. So I recommend her essay to everybody. And while I'm on the topic, I'd also like to acknowledge some of my other debts. And almost all of these will come up in the talk, but I'm glad to be able to single them out in advance. So first, specifically on the topic of Tennyson and Sappho, there's a very important article by Linda Peterson from 1994, which really paved the way, I would say, for Margaret Reynolds' work as well as for me. So that's a major influence. And then in addition to that, there are 3 books. So first there's Jopi Prinz's magisterial study, Victorian Sappho, from 1999, which I think many of you will know. And Prinz doesn't say much specifically about Tennyson in the book, but her account of Sappho and of Sappho's reception, especially of Sappho's reception in 19th century Britain, is just indispensable to anybody who's interested in the topic. And then there are 2 more books which are related to my subtitle. So I didn't include the subtitle in the announcements just because it seemed a bit too fussy. But there is a subtitle. Here, let me show you. Yes, there it is. So as you can see, Tennyson and Sappho Revisited, and then the subtitle, Eleanor, Fatima, and the Erotics of Naming. Okay, so Eleanor, Fatima, these are the 2 early Tennyson poems that I'm going to be speaking about. But the erotics of naming. Well, when it comes to naming in Tennyson, there's one great authority, and that is Anna Barton in her 2008 monograph, Tennyson's Name. Fabulous book, which again, I recommend to everybody. And then when it comes to the erotic, in other words, when it comes to anything having to do with love, my greatest muse of all is Anne Carson, and especially her book, Eros the Bittersweet, from 1986, which is very possibly my favorite nonfiction book of all time. And in fact, starting with my own book on love poetry that Valerie just mentioned, and then in all of the various work that I've done on love and on love poetry since then, I've actually had to make a conscious effort to refrain from relying too much on Anne Carson and from quoting her too much. This is literally the yellow book with which I am obsessed and that I can't get out of my head. So as I say, I try not to invoke her too much. In this case, though, since I'm talking about Sappho specifically, and Carson is the great critic and the great translator of Sappho, it just didn't make any sense to exclude her. So she is the 4th and final pillar undergirding my talk today. So let's go ahead and begin. And I'll begin with Sappho's best known poem. So here it is. This is the poem that we now generally call Fragment 31, but which was known in the 19th century as the Ode to Anna Victoria. And this is Anne Carson's translation of it. He seems to me equal to gods, that man, whoever he is, who opposite you sits and listens close to your sweet speaking and lovely laughing. Oh, it puts the heart in my chest on wings. For when I look at you, even in a moment, no speaking is left in me. No, tongue breaks, and thin fire is racing under skin, and in eyes no sight, and drumming fills ears, and cold sweat holds me, and shaking grips me all. Greener than grass I am, and dead, or almost, I seem to me. Swinburne considered this to be one of the greatest poems ever written. He wrote that it has in the whole world of verse no companion and no rival, except, Swinburne says, for Sappho's other ode, the Ode to Aphrodite, which is the only other complete or near complete poem of Sappho's to have survived. And we'll be looking at that a little bit in a moment. Tennyson shared Swinburne's admiration for Sappho, and especially Tennyson's early poems often reveal her influence. And this is something that readers ever since Arthur Hallam have noted and remarked on. And most obviously, there are two poems in Tennyson's second volume, in his 1832 volume, that directly imitate Fragment 31. And in particular, they imitate the second half of Sappho's poem, the last two stanzas there, where the speaker describes how her body fails her when she looks at the beloved. And I've already mentioned the two poems in my subtitle, Eleanor and Fatima, and here they are. So the first passage that you see there comes from the final stanza of Eleanor. From thy rose-red lips, my name floweth, and then, as in a swoon, with dinning sound my ears are rife. My tremulous tongue faltereth. I lose my color, I lose my breath. I drink the cup of costly death, brimmed with delirious draughts of warmest life. And the second passage actually appears just a few pages later in the same volume, in the 1832 volume. So the next poem but one in that volume is the poem that we usually refer to as Fatima, because that was the title that was given to it in 1842 when it was reprinted, and that's the title that it's borne ever since. In 1832, though, when it first appeared, it had no title. It had only a quotation in Greek, as you can see, of the first line and a half of Sappho's poem. Right? He seems to me equal to gods, that man. And the Greek quotation is, halfway between a title and an epigraph. But either way, it leaves no doubt as to the inspiration behind the second stanza. Okay, so this is how the first two stanzas read in 1832, or actually I should say the first stanza and a half. Oh love, 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 oh withering might, oh sun that at thy noonday height shudderest when I strain my sight, throbbing through all thy heat and light. Lo, falling from my constant mind, lo, parched and withered, deaf and blind, I whirl like leaves in roaring wind. Last night, when someone spoke his name, from my swift blood that went and came, 1,000 little shafts of flame were shivered in my narrow frame. Well, the ultimate cause of the speaker's ecstatic reaction there in stanza 2, I think, is clear. Love, 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 right, as she says in the opening line. An exclamation that's echoed in the more inarticulate lo, lo that follows. So that is the ultimate cause. But the proximate cause of the speaker's ecstasy is a little bit more surprising. In both Tennyson poems, as you will have noticed, the somatic response is triggered by an act of naming. In the first poem, Eleanor names the speaker. In the second, an unspecified someone names the beloved. But Sappho's poem never mentions names, never mentions naming. So it almost looks as if Tennyson has just misremembered Sappho's poem. But that's extremely unlikely. Right? I mean, it's just one of the most famous, most familiar works in the classical canon. And as Swinburne points out, it was a poem that most English schoolboys had to learn by heart. So how then do we explain this anomaly? Well, sorry. Margaret Reynolds, whom I just mentioned before, Reynolds directly addresses that question in her wonderful essay, right? Tennyson reading Sappho. So first of all, she points out that Tennyson imitates Sappho's poem not twice, but 3 times. So in addition to Eleanor and Fatima, there's a fragment called Love and Friendship, which you can find in an appendix to volume 3 of Rix's Tennyson edition. Love and Friendship was unpublished in Tennyson's lifetime, but it was written around the same time as the other 2 poems, Eleanor and Fatima. And there too, as Reynolds points out, not only does Tennyson translate or imitate the same lines from Sappho, but once again, he includes the act of naming. So in that case, in Love and Friendship, the speaker experiences the sapphic symptoms when he himself names the beloved. It's the opposite of Eleanor. In Eleanor, it happens when the beloved names him. Love and Friendship, it's when he names the beloved. And Reynolds accounts for this pattern by arguing that the recurrent trope of naming represents an act of poetic self-assertion. So in essence, if I can sum up her argument, she says that Tennyson forges a name for himself by both invoking Sappho and rewriting her. Okay, and this is how Reynolds puts it. In effect, she writes, Tennyson uses fragment 31 as a reflection for learning his own identity. And that is why Tennyson's distinctive mark appears in all 3 of his inscriptions on Sappho's work. Just as he once wrote notes on the text of her poems, so now he writes his name into her poem. The naming of my, his, her name, so that refers to the different instances in each of the 3 poems. In Eleanor, she names my name. In Fatima, someone names his name, the beloved's name. In Love and Friendship, I name her name. The naming of my, his, her name in each of his revisions of fragment 31 changes Sappho's poem into Tennyson's poem, writes his signature at the bottom of the page. Or to put it another way, just like the infant in section 45 of In Memoriam, who gropes his way into individual consciousness by learning that I am not what I see and other than the things I touch. So Tennyson, and now I'm quoting Reynolds, quote, made himself into Tennyson by seeing that he was other, that he was not Sappho. Well, I must say that I find this argument to be very persuasive. And in fact, everything that follows, as I said, builds on Reynolds. I find myself agreeing with Margaret Reynolds and building on what she has argued far more often than I disagree. But what I really want to do is to ask a question that Reynolds does not raise, which is, why names? Why names? Tennyson could have written his signature, to use Reynolds's image. Tennyson could have varied Sappho's lyric in any number of ways. But he consistently associates erotic ecstasy with the act of naming. And my question is, why? What is the connection between names and love? Why should names carry such erotic power? The answer, I suggest, lies in the erotic power of triangles. And I should say that here too, Reynolds has important things to say, because in her essay, she discusses love triangles, and she discusses them at some length. But I propose a different model than the one that she invokes as a way to understand names and to understand Tennyson's repeated inclusion of them in his sapphic lyrics. And to be specific, my reading depends on Anne Carson's model of triangulation rather than on René Girard's. And I will get back to both of those. But what I'd like to do now is first to think about names in general. Then think about their use specifically in Eleanor and Fatima. And then finally, I'd like to think about how those two poems and the act of naming in those two poems fit more broadly into Tennyson's career. And that last, is a much bigger and much more open-ended topic. So I thought that that might be perhaps where we go in our discussion, right? We're happy to talk about anything, but it might be a starting off point for our discussion at the end. But first, names. The act of naming is always fraught with significance, but I think that it carries a particular charge in an erotic context. Lovers will often develop pet names for each other. Isn't that right? They'll come up with exclusive monikers for private use. And that is because naming is the privilege of possession. So to call each other by invented names is to assert a mutual claim or mutual interest in one another. And moreover, since naming rights traditionally belonged to the creator, right? They belong to the discoverer or the inventor of something. Pet names implicitly recognize the birth of a new being, a being brought into existence by the love relationship itself and by the lover's imagination of each other. And yet, for all that, theories and philosophies of love have had surprisingly little to say about names. And in all of my research, all of my reading about love, I have not come across much, if any, discussion about names. So again, the question is, how are we to understand their role here in Tennyson's love poems? And here is where Anna Barton's book, Tennyson's Name, comes to our assistance. At the very beginning of her book, on page 1, in fact, of her book, Barton identifies a tension that runs throughout Tennyson's poetry. She quotes the line from Ulysses, "I am become a name," right? Line 11 of Ulysses, "I am become a name." And she notes that it represents both a boast and a lament. On the one hand, Ulysses' name is central to his identity, to his heroic identity. His name, as Barton writes, is a monument to himself, supplying proof of his life's achievements. On the other hand, Ulysses' name and all that it suggests stand ironically at odds with the self that he now inhabits. His name has become dissociated from him, an empty signifier. But that duality, so that sense of simultaneous identification with and dissociation from his name, is not peculiar to Ulysses. Ulysses might experience an extreme version of it, but to some extent, that same duality applies to all names. And on this topic, Barton cites John Stuart Mill's System of Logic from 1843, the chapter in which Mill expounds the essential meaninglessness of proper names. So according to Mill, names, or sometimes he calls them proper nouns, unlike common nouns, which designate a class of entities with shared characteristics, names or proper nouns that designate only a single particular individual communicate nothing about the attributes of that individual. Right, and that is clearly true. That is simply intuitive. The two entities could have the same name without having any attributes in common. So, I could very well name my pet lobster John Stuart Mill, but the name would tell us nothing about that creature. Which means that a name, a proper name, is on the one hand identified very strongly with you because it is unique or nearly unique to you. And then on the other hand, bears no inherent relation to you. Your name is, strictly speaking, meaningless. And yet, that very lack of signification can be very powerful. As Barton writes, empty of objective meaning, a name marks out a hollow space that has endless potential. That potential, I think, is clearly illustrated in an anecdote that Tennyson told about his relation to his own name. And this is in the memoir, and so this is probably one that many of you are familiar with. So this is what Tennyson says. A kind of waking trance I have frequently had, quite up from boyhood, when I have been all alone. This has generally come upon me through repeating my own name 2 or 3 times to myself silently, till all at once, as it were out of the intensity of the consciousness of individuality, the individuality itself seemed to dissolve and fade away into boundless being. And this, not a confused state, but the clearest of the clearest, the surest of the surest, the weirdest of the weirdest, utterly beyond words, where death was an almost laughable impossibility, the loss of personality, if so it were, seeming no extinction, but the only true life. So, like Ulysses' name, Tennyson's name here both affirms his identity and effaces it. It's intensely associated with him. It gives him, he says, an intense consciousness of individuality, but it's also self-evidently other, detached, alien. It becomes a meaningless mantra that he can simply repeat. As Barton writes, quote, a name as the verbal and textual signifier of individual consciousness works paradoxically as both the link and the barrier between inner self and external reality. Okay, so that is Anna Barton's phrase, the link and the barrier. Well, the paradox that applies to all names, right, that they are intrinsic to one's identity and yet also alien to oneself, applies a fortiori to the name of Sappho. As Jopi Prins asks in her book, Victorian Sappho, what is Sappho but a name? In Prins's reading, Sappho has experienced a strangely contradictory fate. Namely, or maybe I should say to wit, that even as the knowledge of Sappho herself has evaporated, right, with the loss of nearly all of her poems, so at the same time, the memory of Sappho, this figure called Sappho, has increased with the invocation of her name through the centuries as a sort of byword for lyric poetry. So that the name has, in a sense, become the reality. It has overshadowed the poet and even her poems. As Prins puts it, the memory of Sappho is more like a memorization, since to memorize a name, to make it repeatable, means that one must forget what it means. Or to put it a slightly different way, you could say that literary history has carried out the same process with Sappho that Tennyson did by repeating his own name. By repeating her name, literary history has ensured Sappho's survival, has ensured her immortality, even while effacing her actual identity. And the person who began this operation, in other words, the first one to repeat Sappho's name, was Sappho herself. As Prins observes, the word Sappho appears 4 times in the extant corpus of Sappho's poetry. 3 of those occurrences appear in very small, partially preserved fragments. But the 4th one occurs in what we now call fragment 1, the poem that was formerly known as the Ode to Aphrodite. So the only poem of Sappho's to have survived fully intact. And since Sappho's name is there pronounced by no less a figure than the goddess of love herself, right? It's pronounced by Aphrodite. I think the passage is worth quoting because it serves as a sort of text for our understanding of the erotics of naming. So here it is, and this is Jopi Prins's translation, although I've adapted Prins's translation a little bit. So these are lines from the middle of poem 1 by Sappho. And you, O blessed one, smiling with your immortal face, asked, what again did I suffer? And what again did I call for? And what did I most want to happen in my maddened heart? Whom again shall I persuade to lead you to her love? Who, O Sappho, wrongs you? The second stanza of this extract features arguably the most sublime moment in all of Sappho's poetry. Midway through the second line of that second stanza, Aphrodite suddenly takes over the discourse from Sappho. So up to this point in the poem, I has meant Sappho, and you has meant the goddess. But now the persons switch. What began as Sappho's address to love, right, O blessed one, there in the first line of this extract, what began as Sappho's address to love transforms into love's address to Sappho, O Sappho, in the closing lines. Now, on the one hand, the moment is surprisingly intimate, isn't that right? Indirect discourse becomes direct, past tense becomes present. On the other hand, this moment of naming is also a moment of profound alienation, in that Sappho, the speaking subject of the poem, is dislocated. She's forced to question herself and to perceive herself from the outside. The act of naming, even and perhaps especially naming oneself, is an act of simultaneous sympathy and objectification. So that is the idea that I would like to keep in mind. This idea that names are, in Anna Barton's words, a link and a barrier, a site of intimacy, but also a site of separation or alienation. Because with that in mind, I think we can take a fresh look now at Sappho 31, where we began. Nobody is named in this poem, but it does contain paradoxes very similar to those that we've just been considering. And most paradoxical of all, or most puzzling of all, is the figure of the man in the first stanza, there in line 1. On the one hand, he seems godlike to the speaker because of his proximity to the beloved. On the other hand, he's so insignificant that he disappears from the poem after the first stanza. So, like the Ode to Aphrodite, this poem approaches the beloved by way of a third figure, by way of a mediator. But here, that mediating figure is not the goddess of love, and indeed is not really divine at all, but he's almost wholly insubstantial. So why is he there? Well, the man's presence in fragment 31 transforms the dyadic relationship of lover and beloved into a triangle. The most influential theory of love triangles is the one that was proposed first by René Girard back in the 60s, and then was developed by Yves Sedgwick and others in the 1980s. And this idea is probably familiar to many people, but I'm just going to run through the notion here and refresh your memories. According to this model, love is imitative. In other words, we desire what other people desire. And therefore, in a love triangle, where two people love or desire a third, the strongest affective tie, the strongest emotional tie, lies not between either of the two lovers and the love object, but between the two rival lovers themselves. And Yves Sedgwick uses this model to explain what she calls, following Claude Lévi-Strauss, the traffic in women. Right? The traffic in women, by which she means when two men cement the homosocial bond between themselves through a woman who is somehow passed or shared between them, often in marriage, right? The giving in marriage from one to the other. As I say, this is the most familiar and this is the most influential theory of the love triangle. And it's the one that Margaret Reynolds invokes, and I think to great effect, in her discussion of Tennyson's 3 translations or imitations of fragment 31 that we looked at. In Reynolds's reading, Tennyson and Arthur Hallam deepened or sealed their own relationship through various shared female love objects. Namely, first of all, Tennyson's sister Emily, to whom Hallam was, of course, engaged. And as I said, that's the most classic form of the homosocial traffic in women, is the giving of, a woman from one family to the other. But also, secondly, they did it through the many lady poems, as they're called, that Tennyson wrote at Cambridge. So the lady poems refers to all of those poems with female protagonists and female names as their title that appear in the 1830 and 1832 volumes, and that Tennyson wrote at Cambridge and that Hallam absolutely adored. Okay, and these would include Eleanor and Fatima. And then thirdly, Tennyson and Hallam sealed their bond, says Reynolds, above all through Sappho, whom they both reverenced. As Reynolds concludes, the triangle formed here, Tennyson, Hallam, various women, mimics the triangulation of desire that appears in Sappho's fragment 31. I think it's a wonderful reading of Tennyson and of Hallam and of their relation to Sappho. But I will also say that model, that is to say, the Renee Girard, Eve Sedgwick model of the love triangle, fruitful and enlightening though it often is, I think simply does not apply to Sappho's poem, to fragment 31. Because in Sappho's poem, it's the man, right? It's the rival lover rather than the love object who is so insignificant as to be interchangeable. To my mind, a much more pertinent and a much more persuasive account of the triangle, specifically in Sappho's poem, is given by Anne Carson. Here it is, and it's obviously a fairly long quotation, but it's important. It's central to what I have to say, and I think it's just a marvelous reading of Sappho. So I will read out the whole thing. So this is Anne Carson on fragment 31. She says, "The man who listens closely is no sentimental cliché or rhetorical device. He is a cognitive and intentional necessity. Sappho perceives desire by identifying it as a three-part structure. We may, in the traditional terminology of erotic theorizing, refer to this structure as a love triangle, and we may be tempted with post-romantic asperity to dismiss it as a ruse. But the ruse of the triangle is not a trivial mental maneuver. We see in it the radical constitution of desire. For where eros is lack, its activation calls for three structural components: lover, beloved, and that which comes between them. They are 3 points of transformation on a circuit of possible relationship, electrified by desire, so that they touch, not touching. Conjoined, they are held apart. The third component plays a paradoxical role, for it both connects and separates, marking that two are not one, irradiating the absence whose presence is demanded by eros. When the circuit points connect, perception leaps." Here, Carson offers a reading of Sappho that doubles as a general theory of erotic love. Eros, she reminds us, the Greek word eros means want. It means desire for what is missing. As Socrates explains in the Symposium, you cannot love what you already have. You can only love what you lack. Desire, therefore, leaps to life in the presence of what Carson calls a third component, something that both connects and separates, marking that two are not one, irradiating the absence whose presence is demanded by eros. Now, often, that role of third component is played by language. So think of a love letter. The reason a love letter carries such erotic force is that it forms a bridge between lovers, while also necessarily signifying their separation from each other. So in Carson's pithy and wonderful formulation, it is that which comes between them, in the double sense of obstruction and connection. In Sappho's poem, that third component is embodied in the form of the nameless man. But the erotic catalyst could just as easily take the form of a name, right? A proper name being, as we have seen, both a link and a barrier, intrinsic and alien at once. Carson's model, therefore, helps illuminate the surprising emphasis on names in Eleanor and Fatima. So that brings us back to Tennyson and to our two poems for today. And let's start with Eleanor. So I just said that Sappho's two odes, the Ode to Aphrodite and Fragment 31, that both of them approach the beloved only indirectly, that they avoid direct address to the beloved. Eleanor, however, does precisely the opposite. Tennyson's Eleanor is one of the most intensely second-person poems that I can think of. Some of Tennyson's other lady poems from this period also use the second person, but none of them does it so consistently or at such length. For nearly 150 lines, the male speaker describes Eleanor to herself, cataloging her features to herself, and varying the discourse only occasionally to describe his own reaction to the features that he enumerates. Eleanor is thus a love poem. Okay, that is to say, even if there weren't direct declarations of love in the poem, which there are, but even if there weren't, the lavish praise and the almost obsessive attention mark this out as love discourse. But interestingly, it's a love poem in which all passion remains latent. All passion is held in abeyance. And the speaker is very clear on this point. In fact, sometimes almost disturbingly so. So if we look, there we are. The speaker tells Eleanor, in thee, all passion becomes passionless, touched by thy spirit's mellowness. And then, even more surprisingly, he goes on to say, his bowstring slackened, languid love, leaning his cheek upon his hand, droops both his wings regarding thee. It's a little bit hard to know what to say about these lines. You know, there are some things that a girl just doesn't want to hear from her admirer. And one of them, surely, is that whenever love looks on her, he goes all slack and begins to droop. Right? I mean, his bowstring slackened, languid love droops both his wings regarding thee. Is Tennyson making a joke there? I don't know. I mean, he's not exactly known for his sense of humor. But either way, it certainly makes the contrast all the more striking when in the very next stanza, which is the final stanza of the poem, all of this passion that has been, drooping and languid and all that, all this passion suddenly pours out in a sapphic frenzy. Okay, so this is the next stanza. This is the imitation of fragment 31 that we looked at the beginning, but this is a slightly longer and fuller quotation. My heart a charmed slumber keeps while I muse upon thy face, and a languid fire, so it's languid again, and a languid fire creeps through my veins to all my frame, dissolvingly and slowly. Soon, from thy rose-red lips, my name floweth, and then, as in a swoon with dinning sound, my ears are rife. My tremulous tongue faltereth. I lose my color, I lose my breath. I drink the cup of costly death, brimmed with delirious draughts of warmest life. I die with my delight before I hear what I would hear from thee. Yet tell my name again to me. I would be dying evermore, so dying ever, Eleanor. I think that the easiest way to account for the electrifying effect of the name in this passage is to view it as a form of reciprocation. In other words, Eleanor is speaking to the speaker here, as presumably she has done before on various topics. However, when her discourse to him becomes all about him with the naming of his name, her speech suddenly mirrors the second person discourse that he was producing earlier in the poem. So at that moment, the three elements that typically constitute conversation, I, you, and the topic that we are discussing, condense thrillingly into just two. And hence the speaker does not hear the rest of Eleanor's speech. And apparently he doesn't want to. At the very end of the poem, he asks her only to keep repeating his name. Well, in that sense, naming is arguably the only perfect form of love discourse, because it's the only one that preserves the unadulterated dyad of lover and beloved. And for that reason, the naming of the beloved, so that moment when the person names the beloved, often with dramatic consequences, forms something of a romantic cliche. Okay, this moment in Eleanor is part of a fairly familiar romantic cliche. So for instance, you may remember that Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Lady Geraldine's Courtship contains a very similar moment. The speaker of that poem, Bertram, rants wildly at Lady Geraldine. So there's 8 uninterrupted stanzas of him confessing his love to her, at which point she pronounces the single word, Bertram, and he immediately collapses in a dead faint. Or to take a slightly earlier example from Lord Byron's Manfred, a play which Tennyson would have known and EBB would have known too, since they were both youthful admirers of Byron. In Manfred, the phantom of Manfred's beloved, Astarte, finally appears to him at the end of Act 2, whereupon she repeats his name to him 3 times, leaving him convulsed. Okay, that's Byron's word. So he doesn't actually faint, but he is left convulsed by her pronouncing his name. And my point is that in Eleanor, the same thing seems to be happening. And this reading is all the more plausible because of the hyperextended second person discourse that comprises the first 7 stanzas of Eleanor. When in the 8th and final stanza, Eleanor speaks my name, right? When she speaks the speaker's name, she essentially concentrates the whole of his long speech into a single word of reply. So, no wonder he swoons. As I say, that is one way of reading this moment at the end of Eleanor. However, Anne Carson's model of that which comes between suggests a nearly opposite, but I think even more compelling reading of the same moment. Given the source of Tennyson's lines in Sappho's poem, and given their similarity to Tennyson's own anecdote, in which the repetition of his name affects him so strongly because of its difference from himself, as much as its close association, it makes sense to think of the name in Eleanor, my name, as fulfilling the triangulating function that in Sappho's poem is performed by the man, by the nameless man. So in other words, the moment in Eleanor is erotically charged, specifically because the name remains separate from the speaker himself, a barrier as well as a link between him and Eleanor. And that would explain why in the final lines of the poem, the speaker begs Eleanor simply to repeat his name, right? Rather than asking her, for instance, to declare that she loves him back, to declare her love in return. Her repetition of his name brings it not closer to him, but farther. It estranges his name. It turns it into a refrain. And that's what the speaker desires. The speaker desires not perfect reciprocity, but rather reciprocity enhanced by ongoing separation and distance and defamiliarization. I will also add, just sort of incidentally, that this reading also helps to explain the diaresis in Eleanor. In other words, the two little dots over the A that separate the two central vowels of Eleanor's name. Now, I have always considered myself quite tolerant when it comes to diaresis, but I have to say that this is an instance to which I've never been able to reconcile myself. Those two dots in the title of the poem have always just annoyed me. And they still annoy me. But I will say that they make much more sense in light of the Carsonian reading of the end of the poem. In other words, if we understand the pleasure of that moment when Eleanor names the speaker, if we understand the pleasure of that moment as arising from a sense of alienation and a sense of his name's difference from himself, then it makes sense that he would include that little diacritical mark that turns the common name Eleanor into the more unfamiliar Eleanor. In any case, I think that we get an even clearer example of a name's ability to provide a sense of alienation, right? Not of intimacy, or not just of intimacy, but the sense of separation that Carson says is needed for erotic triangulation. I think we get an even clearer example of that in Fatima. If Eleanor is intensely second person, Fatima is just as intensely first person. It is, in fact, the only poem in Tennyson's first two volumes voiced entirely by a female speaker. We have these two volumes, 1830, 1832, which are famous for the way that they delve into the female psyche. Poems like Mariana, Inoni, The Lady of Shalott. But Fatima is actually the only entirely first-person speech by a woman in those volumes. And as Linda Hughes puts it, and this is one of my favorite things that's ever been written on this poem, quote, Fatima bursts into the gallery of Tennyson's other demure maidens, with much the same effect as a belly dancer in full regalia might have had, who invaded a tea given by Queen Victoria. So let's go ahead and look at the poem, which I think is too often overlooked by Tennyson criticism. Given that, not only does it take the form of first-person dramatic monologue, as I was just saying, but it also constitutes a simply unabashed declaration of female desire that is nearly unprecedented. It's a wonderful poem. I think a much better poem than Eleanor is. And it's only 6 stanzas long, and I'd love to read out the whole thing, but I'm just going to restrict myself to the first half, okay, to the first 3 stanzas, which is the part that I will actually be discussing. There it is. Okay, so these are the first 3 stanzas of the poem as they appeared in 1842. Okay, so this is the second version of the poem, which then became the standard version. O love, 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 O withering might, O sun that from thy noonday height shudderest when I strain my sight, throbbing through all thy heat and light. Lo, falling from my constant mind, lo, parched and withered, deaf and blind, I whirled like leaves in roaring wind. Last night I wasted hateful hours below the city's eastern towers. I thirsted for the brooks, the showers. I rolled among the tender flowers. I crushed them on my breast, my mouth. I looked athwart the burning drought of that long desert to the south. Last night, when someone spoke his name, from my swift blood that went and came, 1,000 little shafts of flame were shivered in my narrow frame. O love, O fire, once he drew with one long kiss my whole soul through my lips, as sunlight drinketh dew. These stanzas read almost like Mariana's repressed inner monologue. And the reason I say that is because Fatima shares with Mariana not only a situation, and that both of them wait alone for the beloved to return, but she also shares a tendency to become conflated with the surrounding landscape. So as Linda Hughes points out, the word throbbing there in the fourth line, O sun, that from thy noonday height shudderest when I strain my sight, throbbing through all thy heat and light. That refers equally to the sun and to the speaker, Fatima, who just shows that in her intense isolation, Fatima absorbs all things into her solitary self. And hence the importance of the second stanza. The second stanza, like the title, was added in 1842. So you remember that that stanza was not there when we looked at the opening stanzas of the original version earlier. Herbert Tucker disapproves of the interpolated stanza, calling it digressive and a little bit silly. But on this one rare occasion, I disagree with Tucker, because this stanza strikes me as crucial. The frankly autoerotic imagery and the anaphora of I at the beginning of the four central lines reinforce the extent to which Fatima's desire has become introverted, entirely internal. And that then sets up the climactic moment in stanza 3 when someone speaks his name. The naming of the beloved by a third person acts so powerfully because it serves as a reification, or I should say, a confirmation of the beloved's existence outside of Fatima's own thoughts and fantasy. So that suddenly, Fatima finds herself not a single burning, all-consuming point like the sun, but once again, one point of a triangle. And that necessary separation of him from herself comes about partly, as in Sappho, through the intervention of a third party, right? That is, say, the unnamed someone. But even more, I think, it comes about as in Eleanor through the act of naming, through the slight alienation and defamiliarization that's inherent in all names. When the beloved is publicly named, he becomes both more real to Fatima and more distinct from her, which is why she suddenly goes all Sappho in the lines that follow. And I think it's significant, and I think that it's natural, that the moment of naming leads directly into Fatima's memory of the kiss, right? With its wonderfully erotic, breathless enjambments. These are some of my favorite lines in the poem. Once he drew with one long kiss my whole soul through my lips, as sunlight drinketh dew. Kissing, like naming, is an act of intimacy that nevertheless preserves distance. And here, as so often in European love poetry, the kiss is figured as a means for one soul to mingle with another. So it's a moment of ecstatic union. And yet, lips will always be an imperfect physical medium for that mingling, a place where bodies touch, yet necessarily remain separate, even as a name remains separate from its referent. Or for that matter, even as lines of poetry remain separate across the enjambment that connects them. And that gap between enjambed lines, between the name and the person that it refers to, between the souls of lovers, even as they embrace, that is where Eros lives. So that is really what I have to say about the relationship of naming to love, which, as I say, is my main concern. But as I said at the beginning, I'd like to conclude with a fairly brief coda of sorts, just 5 minutes or so, by considering how these two poems, and especially how their emphasis on the power of names, fit in with Tennyson's other early poems and how they fit in to his career as a whole. So Tennyson's first volume, his first solo volume, Poems Chiefly Lyrical from 1830, that volume presents two different models of the effectiveness of language. And both of those models continue to resonate in Tennyson's later work. The first model appears most prominently in The Poet. Okay, The Poet, if you remember that poem, is a paean to the sublime efficacy of words. The eponymous poet pronounces words that are said to fly from his silver tongue from Gibraltar all the way to Caucasus. And then the poem concludes with an image of freedom. Okay, so here it is. This is the last stanza of the poem. And as I say, this is describing a personification of freedom. No sword of wrath her right arm whirled, but one poor poet's scroll, and with his word she shocked the world. If you happen to have read Ben Lerner's little monograph, The Hatred of Poetry, okay, this began as an essay for the London Review of Books in 2015, and then it was expanded into a very short book in 2016. And if you happen to be familiar with it, you will recognize this stanza as exactly the sort of thing that Lerner says makes people hate poetry. Because Lerner argues that a feeling of hatred or contempt for poetry, and he means not only from outside, but also and especially from inside. So he's talking about a feeling of animosity that's experienced by devoted readers of poetry and by poets themselves. And he says that that animosity derives from the difference between the transcendent ideal of poetry, such as that, voiced by Tennyson here in this stanza, and the necessarily more limited achievement of actual poem. Because by the world-shaking standards of Tennyson's The Poet, all poems are bound to disappoint. And yet, Tennyson continues to cling to his dream of poetic and linguistic power. And that dream finds its most consistent expression, I would say, in the motif of poems or songs that build cities, right? Which you'll remember is a motif that runs right through Tennyson's work. So Tithonus from 1860, though drafted in 1833, Tithonus refers to that strange song I heard Apollo sing, while Ilion, like a mist, rose into towers. Tiresias from 1885, although also partly written much earlier, similarly speaks of the song-built towers and gates of Thebes. Oenone from 1832 contains a reference, just like Tithonus, to Troy being built up by Apollo's song. So apparently, in Tennyson's mind, poetry can construct a world as well as shape the world. But it's significant that in every instance, the murific power of words is located in the distant mythical past. And the reason that I say that's significant is because the second model that's put forth in 1830 presents language as totally impotent. And this is the model found in the Kraken, where communication is reduced to an inarticulate cry of pain and helpless protest, as we see especially in the final line of the Kraken. In roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. Well, of those two opposing models, the second one, so the notion of language as being ultimately impotent, is surely the more prominent in Tennyson's poetry overall. Most notably, it recurs in Memoriam, which claims to have no language but a cry, and which repeatedly doubts the power of words to make any effect besides the very bluntest effect. But it's not just in Memoriam. The same motif can be found in many Tennyson poems. And perhaps its most impressive manifestation comes, and here I'm actually borrowing an example or an observation from Herbert Tucker from Achilles Over the Trench. There it is. So this is one of two blank verse passages that Tennyson, two passages from the Iliad that Tennyson translated into blank verse in the 1870s. And this passage describes Achilles' war cry as he surveys the battle in which his beloved Patroclus has been killed. And Iacides here is just another name for Achilles. And a boundless panic shook the foe. For like the clear voice when a trumpet shrills, blown by the fierce beleaguerers of a town, so rang the clear voice of Iacides. And when the brazen cry of Iacides was heard among the Trojans, all their hearts were troubled, and the full-maned horses whirled the chariots backward, knowing grief's at hand. And sheer astounded were the charioteers. Now, on the one hand, Achilles' shout could be said to be highly effective. It shakes the Trojans there in the first line, just as the poet's word shakes the world in the earlier poem. And yet, Achilles' voice can do nothing at all to bring back the dead Patroclus. In its mingled grandeur and futility, the cry of Achilles resembles the song of the dying swan from back in 1830. The swan's awful, jubilant voice floods the surrounding countryside. And yet her song, for all of its beauty, is impotent to avert, indeed is inseparable from, her impending death. So, this is obviously a big topic, and there's much to be said about it, and there's much that has already been said about it. And among the many, many things that have been written about this topic, namely the struggle in Tennyson's poetry between faith in language on the one hand, and something like inarticulate despair on the other, amongst all the many things that have been written, I would single out the brilliant chapter on In Memoriam in Marion Shaw's wonderful book, her 1988 book on Tennyson, where she treats this dichotomy particularly well. But just to conclude, the reason that I bring up this dichotomy is that it seems to me that Eleanor and Fatima offer us a third model of language, one that manages to synthesize the other two. Their version of a word, in their case, a name, a word that stuns or overwhelms the hearer, resembles the world-shaking word of the poet, but it's much more believable. It's much less likely to elicit skepticism or resentment in learners' terms. At the same time, the act of naming in those two poems verges towards the inarticulacy of the Kraken or of Achilles. The all-powerful word in Eleanor and Fatima is indeed a word. It's not just a roar or a cry, but as a proper name, it hovers on the borders of meaninglessness, as John Stuart Mill says. It's a word that does signify, but it signifies only one thing and no more. So to conclude, just as in Sappho's poem, speech is both the cause of love, your sweet speaking, Sappho says, sets my heart on wings, and is also love's first casualty. Tongue breaks, says Sappho, and no speaking is left in me when I behold you. So in Tennyson's poems, language is exalted and abjected at once. Thank you. I will stop there.